Well, hello there, everybody, and welcome back to my crash course in formal logic. In this section, I'm going to study formal and informal fallacies because by now you've learned an awful lot about arguments, deductive and inductive, and we're going to study the techniques of analyzing those argument types in just a few lessons. But first, a little detour. Now, a fallacy is a type of defect in an argument other than the falsity of its premises, and that defect always generates bad inferences. The defects we're going to study can be of the formal or informal variety. Now, when I talk about a formal fallacy, the term formal has nothing to do with formal wear or formal occasions. It has to do with argument forms. We said earlier, arguments sometimes have shapes. So a formal defect is a defect in structure, and those types of fallacies are only found in deductive arguments. And in order to find them, all you have to do is look at the form or shape of the argument and see if it's a correct form. By way of contrast, an informal fallacy is not a defect pertaining to form. Rather, there's some type of diversion or vagueness, some kind of illicit assumption that's throwing off your inference. In order to detect those, you've got to actually examine the content, not just the shape of the argument. Consider this. All bullfights are violent events, and all executions are violent events. Two true premises. Does it follow that all bullfights are executions? Well, maybe opponents of bullfights would like to think so, but consider this. Swap out the term execution. Swap it out for the term boxing matches. All bullfights are violent events. All boxing matches are violent events. Therefore, does it follow that all bullfights are boxing matches? Now that seems ridiculous. Bullfights are violent events and executions are violent events, but it does not follow, in either of these cases actually, that all bullfights are executions or that all bullfights are boxing matches. What we have here is an argument shape, all A are B and all C are B, and we tried to reach the conclusion that all A are C. That means we've got a bad shape to our arguments, and that type of defect will always give you a bad deductive inference. That's a formal fallacy. Now consider this, if apes are intelligent, then apes can solve puzzles. And apes can solve puzzles. Does it follow that apes are intelligent? Well, this argument has the structure if A, then B, and B is satisfied, should we move to the conclusion that A? Now consider this example. If Tom Cruise is a physicist, then he can solve puzzles, and he can solve puzzles. Should we move to the conclusion that he's a physicist? Notice here we have the exact same structure of argument, but in this case we reached a ludicrous conclusion on the basis of two premises. What went wrong? Well, what went wrong was a problem in each case involving bad shape or forms of arguments. In either case, if A then B, B therefore A, or all A are B, all C are B, therefore all A are C, these are bad argument shapes or forms and they are to be rejected anytime you find them. Now, informal fallacies are different. Consider this, if the Brooklyn Bridge is made of atoms and, secondly, atoms are invisible, does it follow that the Brooklyn Bridge is invisible? No, it doesn't. But what went wrong with our inference? Well, what happened here is that we moved from a property of the parts, the atoms, and we moved to a property of the whole, the bridge. And sometimes that sort of move from parts to whole is justified, and sometimes it's not. In this case, though, we've committed a fallacy. Now, here's another one. A chess player is a person. Does that mean that a bad chess player is a bad person? Well, now what do we do with this sort of inference? The problem here is we're using two different definitions of the word bad. Bad can mean without moral character, like a bad person, and bad can mean lacking competence, which means a bad chess player is not a competent chess player. We've equivocated upon our term. Now you notice that in the last two examples there were no defects in the shape or form of an argument, but rather we had some illicit assumptions going on. Now we're going to study those sorts of things in detail, so let's talk about informal fallacies, starting with fallacies of relevance. Now, these sorts of fallacies work by appealing to your emotions or by negatively characterizing somebody you might dislike, or appealing to laziness, pride, superstition, anything like that so that you will accept the conclusion. The way I like to characterize it is that you have two sides of your brain, one side that deals with reason, logic, control, science, and those sorts of things, the analytic matters, and the other side that deals with intuition, creativity, and passion. What I think is happening here is that the left-hand side of the brain and the right-hand side of the brain aren't doing their respective jobs. So what happens is that you get premises that are logically irrelevant to a conclusion, but they start to appear psychologically relevant because part of your brain that deals with things like intuition and emotion and things like that starts to get involved making your inference for you. First fallacy up on our list to study, the appeal to force, argumentum ad baculum. Actually, it means the appeal to the stick. That occurs when an arguer motivates you to make an inference by some sort of psychological or physical threat of harm, rather than by logical connections between premises and conclusions themselves. For example, somebody may say smoking spoils your looks, or for every Bush vote, God kills a kitten. Now, there's a very clear and explicit appeal to not logic, but actually a sense of irrational fear to motivate a conclusion. The conclusion being, you shouldn't vote for Bush. Well, what about this? Intelligent design debates and evolution debates are getting off the ground really heavily still. But what about people who say that if we allow intelligent design in the classroom, we'll have to allow flat earth geography or different theories of sex ed and burn witches and use leeches in medicine? Now, that seems like an argumentum ad baculum. They're using a psychological threat of harm to motivate the conclusion that we shouldn't teach people alternative theories of human origins, and that's not fair. Now, in this cartoon, Charlie Brown is running away from one of his friends who says, "I'll get you, Charlie Brown. I'll get you and I'll knock your block off." And Charlie Brown turns around and stops her. "Wait a minute. We can't carry on like this. We have no right to act this way. Actually, the world's filled with problems, and if we children can't solve our relatively minor problems, how can we expect the adults to?" And Wacky takes it right on the jaw. She explains, "I had to hit him quick. He was beginning to make sense." Now, thankfully for us, most of the time when you find an argumentum ad baculum, it appeals to an imaginary threat of harm or an imaginary threat of force. In this case, however, Charlie Brown got the real variety. Now, you're probably feeling like you've gotten the idea of an appeal to force and why it's a bad inference generator, but I want to note here that some arguments involving worry and fear are not fallacies. There are such things as arguments from or for reasonable concern. If somebody says to you, your friends are natural-born jokers and tomorrow's St. Patrick's Day, therefore you shouldn't wear green, because you'll get pinched a lot. Well, that seems like a good argument for the claim that if you don't wear green, you are going to get pinched a lot. Even though there's worry involved in this argument, that's not what backs the inference or justifies it. Or if somebody tells you you've been late to work 3 times this week and your boss fired the last person who was late 4 times, therefore you'll probably be fired unless your attendance improves. This looks like a good inductive argument for the conclusion in question, and whether or not worry is involved is not a concern here. What happens is that the two sides of your brain are doing their work respectively. One side is saying on the emotional end, "I'm scared," and the other side, governing reason and logic, says, "Yeah, and based on the evidence, you probably should be." No fallacy is committed in those cases. Closely related, the appeal to pity, argumentum ad misericordem, occurs when an arguer attempts to motivate the inference simply by pity evoking. Now, that is a fallacy and bad inference making. So, for example, if somebody tries to argue that they shouldn't be found guilty of driving through a school zone at a reckless speed on the following grounds: "Well, after all, it's not fair. I was late to work, I'll lose my job, and I have 4 kids. Now, this guy is sympathy mongering. He's guilty as sin, probably. Now, once again, you got to be careful. Not every argument that evokes pity is a fallacy. Sometimes very good and sound arguments evoke pity, but the inference was not generated simply on the basis of pity. So if you see an argument that you ought to be contributing to world aid or something like that, this is an argument from compassion that may evoke pity on your part, but the inferences were justified by logic alone. And the same thing holds in court cases in which you find mitigating circumstances like the age of the defendant and knowledge of the relevant laws, inappropriateness of sentences. Now, if you find arguments in this that evoke sympathy on your part, double check to see if the logic backs your inferences. What you may find is that in your brain you're getting some sniffles out of a case that ought to rightly, according to the reasonable side of your brain, be evoking some sympathy on independent and logical grounds. Appeals to the people are very popular. Argumentum ad populum. We always have a need socially to be liked, to be loved, to be admired, to belong. But if we make inferences based on those needs alone, we're committing fallacies. Schroeder is a good example of this. Actually, he's a good example of how to avoid it. Now for the #1 hit song across the nation, and when Schroeder listens, he says, "This nation's in sad shape." That's probably the right inference. Whether or not a song is popular does not determine whether or not the song was actually worthwhile or worth listening to. Adpopulums can be of the direct or the indirect variety. Now, when it happens directly, an arguer is in the context of all his friends or a group of people, and the group of people gets excited through emotions, and a person tries to just go with that crowd that they're part of. This serves in cases of mob mentality, when people make speeches at conventions, things of that nature. When this happens, you oftentimes find emotional accusations, communist, you right-wing fashion, hater, something that gets people's emotions in the mob charged up so that individuals in the mob are tempted just to go along with the flow. The indirect variety is much more common. Now look at Calvin here, turning on the television and just asking it to pander to him. He's being addressed separately by the television, but typically the television will remind him that he has a relationship to the crowd and that he wants to win their exception. That will get Calvin here to make bad inferences. So when people are reminded that they are part of the crowd, even if that crowd is absent, well, then you've got the indirect approach. A person can be reminded of this through advertisements, thinking that if they do what the advertisement says, like buy a product, then they're going to be loved and accepted just like the people in the advertisements are. That's a clear case of an indirect ad populum argument. You often find this indirect ad populum used in advertisements because advertisers have to address individuals in their homes or individually away from crowds. These advertisements are often bad inferences to the claim that you ought to be buying our product. Now, bandwagoning is another and related form of indirect ad populum. Basically, the idea is if you don't get on with everybody else or get on the bandwagon, then you're going to be left behind, and nobody wants to be left out. We're just social animals that way. So if you get that sort of inference or motivation for an inference, you're making a bad one, an informal fallacy, we said. And appeals to vanity or snobbery occur, especially in advertisements, when someone associates their product with someone admired or pursued or imitated, so that they'll make you think that if you buy their product, you too will be admired and pursued. Check out this example. If a little girl wants to be like Britney Spears, go out and buy some milk and drink it. Actually, I like the conclusion of that argument, but the motivation for the conclusion is fallacious. So remember, Calvin, when the television addresses you and panders to you, it's typically reminding you that you are a member of a larger crowd and trying to make you make inferences on the basis of that sub-rational and sub-logical motivation. Now let's talk about arguments against the person, the ad hominem argument. There are three subvarieties, the abusive, circumstantial, and tu quoque argument. What they all have in common is that they involve two arguers. Somebody makes an argument, and the second person tries to get around that argument. So it's a diversion strategy. Get around the argument and attack that first arguer's person directly. Ad hominem is not a legitimate debate tactic. It is not a legitimate way of responding to an argument. If you want to respond to an argument, attack its factual claims or the strength of its inference, not the person who made the argument. The ad hominem abusive is pretty common. That happens when instead of responding to the person's argument, you just pour out verbal abuse on the person and their character. Say bad things about them. So if you respond to a person's argument by name-calling, calling them a traitor, coward, communist, fascist, well then, if they've made an argument and you try to divert this way, you're committing the ad hominem fallacy in the abusive variety. The ad hominem circumstantial is much more common, though. You don't pour out verbal abuse, but you respond to an opponent trying to discredit them by associating with them with certain circumstances or showing that they have certain predispositions to argue the way they did. Basically, you play Sigmund Freud and try to psychologically analyze your opponent. This is a very common diversionary tactic. So if you're in the context of a debate and your opponent has presented an argument and then you turn around and try to analyze what's going on inside their head, chances are you are committing the ad hominem circumstantial fallacy. Respond to arguments when they're present. Don't respond to the arguer or make unsubstantiated psychological claims about their person. The tu quoque fallacy, or the you too fallacy, occurs when an arguer tries to defend themselves by saying, yeah, but my opponent is just as guilty. Now notice, this is sometimes called the two wrongs make a right fallacy. If your opponent is wrong, that doesn't automatically make you right. If you want to the fallacy here is when you assume that by attacking them, you've defended yourself. So in this case, you have a political cartoon where the GOP attacks the Democrats by a you too fallacy. In this Garfield cartoon, for example, Garfield is busy attacking Nermal. Now, let's assume that Garfield has made an argument that you're too cute, and cute is tasteless, and cute rots the intellect. But Nermal commits a fallacy by saying, "What's so hot about ugly?" You got a problem with your personal appearance too, Garfield. And whether or not that's the case, it doesn't really defend Nermal against the original argument. Nermal has to do better. I don't have any easy mnemonic device for remembering the tu quoque fallacy or the you-too fallacy, but maybe this little slide will help you out. If so, all the better. Their songs are really just 3 chords long, all the darn time. Now, I'm not trying to say here that you can never attack a person or make an ad hominem attack like somebody's a nagger or somebody's not doing what they need to do for their kids. What I'm saying is an ad hominem fallacy is committed as a dodge to get around somebody's arguments. Now, I'm not ruling out simply presenting negative reports on somebody. Sometimes that's a perfectly rational thing to do. For example, John Wayne Gacy, I think, is a perfectly evil person on the basis of the premises that he killed a lot of young innocent men and hid their bodies in the crawl space of his house. Now, those observations are relevant to the conclusion of what kind of person John Wayne Gacy is. Furthermore, observations about a person may be relevant to whether or not a person actually did something or committed a crime. It may be relevant to promises and testimony as to whether or not you should put any weight in them. When you attack promises and testimony, or you attack a person's guilt or innocence on the basis of these observations, no fallacy is being committed. Remember, the fallacy only occurs when you try to dodge people's arguments by going after the person directly. Now, strawmanning, or the strawman fallacy, occurs when you distort or make a strawman out of your opponent and their views. By attacking the view that you've distorted, you try to reach the conclusion that the opponent's original position has been destroyed. You set up a strawman and, bang, gave it a thrashing. Before you go attacking anybody's position, it really is your obligation to try and understand their position as best you possibly can to avoid misrepresentation and simplification. If you go ahead and misrepresent or simplify their view, like if you tried to simplify evolutionary theory to make evolution a nice target for your attacks, you knock down a straw man and claim victory. Those 3 steps always commit the straw man fallacy. But the creationists are not the only ones committing this fallacy. Try this one. Evolutionists often accuse creationists of just saying, hypothesis, Darwin was wrong, experiment, read your Holy Bible, and here's the results. Now, I know that the creationists are wrong, but this is not the way that they argue, and it is not their view. It's very unfair to them to misrepresent them this way. Now, strawmanning galore happens in these sorts of debates. Consider this cartoon. Somebody says, teach an alternative theory to evolution, and somebody distorts the position to say, what you mean is teach the alternative to everything. Teach alchemy as opposed to chemistry. Teach magic as opposed to science. Teach astrology as opposed to astronomy. Clearly, the original position that alternative theories of origins ought to be explored is being distorted maliciously to make it an easy thing to attack. The same thing happens in this vaguely disguised attack on the ACLU. In one panel, the ACLU is depicted as defending people's expression of religious opinion. In the right-hand side, hypocritically, they're depicted as being against displays of religious expression. Now, wait a minute. Is the ACLU's position really that all and no positions on religion ought to be publicly expressed? No, there's a difference between personal and public displays. And so the ACLU's position is being distorted to make them a straw man. And in this case, you have evolution being attacked by somebody who depicts evolutionary theorists as basically saying, we don't know any of the details yet, but we really know we evolved. Now, that's not the evolutionist position. They think we know some of the details, in fact, a great many of them, but their position is being depicted as a position arguing from ignorance, and that's not fair. Well, if you want to study strawmanning more, just go to your favorite political talk show program and you're going to find tons of strawmanning happening in the political arena. But let's move on. Missing the point, or the ignoratio elenchi, is a term devised by Aristotle, meaning ignorance of the proof. And the reason is, the premises of the arguer's argument does support a conclusion. So what goes wrong in these arguments? Well, what happens is that the arguer draws a different or related conclusion that was not supported by the premises. If you're going to criticize people who make this mistake, be able to identify the correct conclusion. The correct conclusion is the one that genuinely did follow from the premises. Consider this political cartoon. A sociopath, a gun control advocate, and a law-abiding citizen are sitting in a bar, and the sociopath pulls a gun on the two. What does the gun advocate do? He advocates more restrictive gun control laws. Looks like we have premises that would back that sort of conclusion. But he advocates them on the law-abiding citizen. Now, the law-abiding citizen, according to this cartoonist, ought to say, hey, you drew the wrong conclusion from the facts that we just discovered. Red herrings are another type of diversionary fallacy. The arguer tries to divert the subject to a different and sometimes subtly related subject, and it assumes, here's the fallacy, that by settling the second issue that the one diverted to, they are settled the original issue that was brought up. So, did you order the plastic bags? Asked Dilbert. Well, they take 2 weeks for delivery. Notice there was a shift in the conversation. Dilbert says, I see you've avoided my actual question in favor of an imaginary one. He says, now I'm fantasizing about ripping your mustache off, and the guy says, well, I hear that a lot. Again, diversionary or red herring tactics to avoid arguments or issues. And since I do advocate some form of evolutionary theory, I kind of hesitate to bring up this example, but in the first panel, somebody brings up a scientific challenge to evolution. What does the red herring do? Diverts the topic to whether or not we should have separation of church and state. The third panel illustrates the right response. Reaffirm the original challenge. And this illustrates that the red herring can be committed in two different ways. There is the subtle technique. In the last cartoon we looked at, there was a subtle change in subject. We stayed on the topic of evolution and the relationship of religion and science, but the change in topic was a subtle one so that the reader or listener wouldn't catch it. The alternative way to commit the red herring is just use some glitzy, eye-catching topic guaranteed to distract, because people would rather talk about things like sex, crime, and disaster than a genuine intellectual topic just about any day. Just a couple last notes on the red herring. The term red herring actually comes from a hunting dog history. If you had a good hunting dog and you trained them, they should not be distracted by powerful smells like red herrings if, for example, they were supposed to be hunting a rabbit. And the same thing goes for you as a logician. If you're supposed to be hunting down good arguments and good positions, don't get distracted by either subtle changes in topic or distracted by glitzy and eye-catching ones. Don't let the red herring take you off the original trail. Red herrings are a very common hot seat maneuver. They occur precisely when a person can't get around the original argument or topic and would like to move on to a different one. Hold people to the fire. For those of you who need help reviewing, here's a little short list that you can refer to memorize the 7 fallacies and their subtypes that we've discussed today. Well, that's all for now. Thank you for listening to about 20 minutes of logic material. So far, so good. Wait for my exercises and my next logic lesson on other types of informal fallacies. We'll see you then.